So it's my great pleasure to announce Professor Heckman now, who's going to talk to us about his work on early childhood formation, and in particular focusing on his new line of research regarding interactions as investments. All right, thank you, Professor Heckman, for presenting here today.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm really sorry that I'm not able to attend in person because of these health threats. And I really was looking forward. The group of people at this conference and the set of topics discussed are really very much down my alley. And I really would have enjoyed having one-on-one interactions. And I do hope to be able to listen to maybe some of the stored recordings here of these lectures. So without further ado, let me just describe my co-author, Zhou Jen, who's also on the line and will be able to make some comments as required. I would point out that I did agree to lecture in the summer school too, which will be on Thursday, next Saturday. And we're going to elaborate some of these themes, but talk about some earlier work that forms the foundation for what we're talking about today, as well as some of the details about today's lecture. So what we want to talk about, and this is something, I see the Ratio is on the line here, so I assume that he's speaking on something related because we're working on similar types of data. They're studying the early childhood investment and its consequences. And this is a huge issue and a huge problem and a huge, very global interest in this topic. And today I want to analyze a low-cost home visiting program that's been conducted in China, but it's based on a widely emulated format that was developed in Jamaica. And this program has been shown to be highly effective. Ratio has some papers. I have a new paper on Jamaica where we follow children from a randomized trial done some 30 years ago, and we see strong effects at age 31, both on economic outcomes and social and emotional skills. Today, what I want to talk about is the mechanisms producing the success of these programs. And I want to investigate the impact of this program on multiple dimensions of skill. A lot of the previous work is focused on cognitive skill or certain limited numbers of skill. I'm interested today in looking at a variety of measurements and even constructing some new measurements, which I'll tell you about. So what I want to do is discuss the dimensionality of skills, the evolution of those skills, and the role of ability in skill formation. And I want to look at the mediators of the so-called inputs that produce learning, both environmental and programmatic. I want to develop a new microdynamic model of multiple skill formation that looks at skill formation at a much more granular level than previous analyses, or at least analyses that we're aware of. And what we do is we test for something called age invariance of skills. Age invariance is a crucial assumption maintained in the recent literature estimating the technology of skill formation. And it makes a strong assumption about a constant unit measuring stick for skills over ages and over the lessons or instructions that children get. And so what we want, and this is important because technology-based estimates of dynamic complementarity depend crucially on this assumption. Cunha and I discussed this with Shanak, Wiswell, Augustinelli, and recently Freiberger has some very nice work on this problem. So people are probably familiar with the technology of skill formation. It's equation 1 on this slide. I'm not going to beat it to death, but what it does is it tells you how a vector of skills, age theta, a plus 1, is formed as a function of the skill stock at age A, investment, and other environmental variables. And the distinction between IA and GA is a little bit unclear and it's flexible in application. But there are key properties of this technology. One is a positive derivative. No depreciation is essentially, there is some productivity. But there's also dynamic complementarity that's increasing with age. And that has important implications for asking of whether or not we can compensate later for early deficits and whether or not it's effective to invest early on in life. Now, there are 3 big questions in this literature. At least I would say there are 3 big questions. And that is, what is I sub A, investment? There are a lot of different examples that are used. They're used sometimes different papers use different frequencies of definitions of these, and sometimes never really fully defined. The state the intervention is given. Secondly, the question is, so how to measure? What is IA? Secondly, what is the micro mechanism underlying the technology? And this is something that child development psychologists have focused a lot on. write books on, famous papers on. It's called scaffolding, and it involves parent-caregiver child interactions. But these are not much studied in a formal setting. And that's one of the things we want to do today. We want to analyze the determinants of these interactions and their consequences for learning. And finally, coming back to this age and variance question, the whole question is, how do we measure skills? This is something that has been around for a long time, and it's more general than just the early childhood literature. The whole value-added literature is based tremendously on this age and variance assumption, that somehow skills can be measured by test scores and that the absolute difference in test scores has any meaning. When of course we know that these are arbitrary, that a test score, any monotonic transformation of a test score is still a valid test score. And therefore, the best we can do, it's clear, it's obvious, a lot of papers note this recently, but it's been around for a while, and that is that ordinal production functions can be estimated. However, some of the cardinal properties like dynamic complementarity measured within a production function framework really depends on the scale that are chosen. And so it's obvious that there are issues about scale. This goes back to Todd and Wolfen's early work. They were using things like words spoken by age as a measure of human capital. That's really what we're talking about in this instance here. But they're very, very strong assumptions. And the question is, do we have a metric that allows us to meaningful talk about derivatives and things that have measure? So what the main findings are is the following. We find strong evidence of home visiting of program effectiveness, but it varies across skills, level of skill, and age, and it varies by family background and child ability level. What we do is we develop new measures of learning, skills, and ability, and we test for dimensionality and the persistence of the skills formed. We build an empirically concordant dynamic model of learning to interpret the evidence that we assemble here. And we actually present a test, a formal test of age and variance, but we find evidence for it only over certain ranges of skill, which we define and test, but not globally. And we find evidence for depreciation and acquisition of new skills by age. But we do find evidence outside of these particular measurements. We find evidence of dynamic complementarity using non-parametric methods. And so another way to think about dynamic complementarity, and it has multiple manifestations, is how important is mastery of previous skills in learning new skills? Can lagging students catch up as an aspect of this? How important is prior knowledge to advance in subsequent learning? And so we're going to address those questions. And what's the effect of ability? If you think that ability is acquired, it's an aspect of investment, and the ability outcome relationship is really an investment relationship is really an aspect of the dynamic complementarity question. So I want to talk briefly about the parent program. I don't have a lot of time. Hopefully we'll talk about this Saturday. We're going to talk about the Jamaica REACH program, data and treatment effects, dynamic models of learning. It's a latent Markov process model. And we want to look at model fit and interpretation and some conclusions. So the program, I won't be able to describe in great detail. It's based on a Jamaican home visiting program. I'll only describe it briefly. It has an effect. It's launched in the 1980s, a brilliant group of young, and at that time, young psychologists working in Barbados, working in Kingston, Jamaica, developed this program for stunted children with an attempt to try to make them catch up and get them caught up. So how do they do this? Well, they had two types of intervention. A nutrition intervention, remember it was stunting, and that's deal with nutrition, but also stimulation, cognitive stimulation. And what happened is they were visitors from a center who visited these parents once a week or once every so often, usually once a week, but it's not perfectly once a week. And then they look at teach the parent how to interact with the child. And what we found, and what they found, is long-lasting effects for cognitive and social and emotional skills. And so today we want to look at a program that was spawned by this, and that's the China REACH program. This is a larger program. The original program was like 120 kids, 129 kids. Here we have 1,500 subjects in one of the poorest provinces in China. And we've written previously on this topic, and we'll talk about that Saturday a bit. But what we did is we did discuss ways of measuring difficulty adjusted test scores and trying to recover latent skill models, latent skill and impacts of the intervention on latent skills, and understanding the mechanisms there through which the treatment effect operates in terms of enhanced use of existing skills. Oops. And the randomization design was basically one of looking at a village, paired villages. And it was a non-bipartite Hellenovus matching method. And we originally pair villages within each other and then randomize which village gets treatment. And so the home visiting intervention is at 100% participation in each village if they're chosen. And what it is, it's a program that's locally adapted. I can't describe it in great detail, but the home visitor is about the same level of education as the mother of the child. And we have trained visitors who visit with the home visitor every once in a while, usually once a month, and provide a report on the nature of the interaction of the visitor, or the home visitor, who's teaching the mother how to interact with the child, how well that home visitor interacts with the parent and the child. And therefore we have data not only on the direct intervention, but how the intervention is being conducted, how well it's being conducted. And so the curriculum is really one that's very, very straightforward, but it's very rigid. And this helps us a lot in terms of econometric identification. There are about 3 to 4 different skills taught each week. So it's not focusing on a single skill. It's focusing on this list here: motor skills, fine motor skills, language and cognitive skills. And these are measured. And it's taught at a weekly basis. And crucially, it's measured at a weekly basis. So the skills that are taught in order are ordered by difficulty level, following patterns that have been developed in the literature by psychologists Palmer and Hunt and Ruth Gieris. This pattern of skill difficulty is used a lot in the literature. It underlies a lot of different studies, and including these studies that we're talking about today. And so we can use these skills and use these measures of skills. And here's an example of a typical program. In a given age, say between 6 months and 42 months, which is the duration of the program in terms of the age of the child, you see this number of tasks. We call them tasks. There's a lesson, if you will. The children are expected to learn. And you do it by level of, by the different tasks that we talked about. Language plays a role. You can see that fine motor skills are playing a role. And the language skills get to be more frequent the later the age of the child. And the cognitive skills are certainly getting more frequent the later the age of the child. So there really is a sense, but these skills are placed at different levels. And the crucial thing is that you look at the pictures and you vocalize, that's level 1, and you go through a level of stories, a level of tasks, which are ordered as the psychologists perceive it. And the crucial thing to notice, though, is that any child who comes into this program at a given age, say age 18 months, okay? So if you look at that age, all children who are 18 years, months old will get the same lesson format, independent of whether they've been in the program before. And crucial to our identification strategy is that children are entering these programs at different ages and at random. And what we see then is also that this rigid curriculum is implemented child by child everywhere where it's implemented. Okay, and so we have a list of difficulties, and what we're going to do, and here's an example, with each level, there's a very detailed discussion about what is difficulty level 1, what the tasks are. And so if you look at this, I realize we don't have a lot of time, but if you look at it, you'll see a lot of these tasks are very, very similar. They're equal, well, they're judged to be equally demanding. And what happens is, for example, with cognitive tasks, is there's a difficulty level that's increasing with age generally, although sometimes there is move to jump back and take a previous lesson and then try to jump forward again. But there is this rigid, relatively rigid format. And this is actually what happened in these villages that we are studying today. Now today, in terms of an econometric identification assumption, Normally, these are stated in terms of function spaces. But what we're really doing is we're going to rely on a crucial assumption that the task within a specific difficulty level target mastery of a specific skill, and that there really is a sense of a common scale across tasks, but only within a level, and that's crucial. So we have a very fine-grained detail in this setup, okay? And we have previous work. We're going to talk a little bit about it. And I'll just say that the impacts, if you look at our previous papers, we see strong effects on cognitive and non-cognitive effects of treatment effects. And the Jamaican program and the China program at the same ages are comparable in terms of the growth of the children in the program. So what we do is we measure the child development during weekly home visits. And we have also these supervisor records of how the home visitors are interacting with the children. And so here's a list of interactions. We can't go through them all, but they're very detailed. The observer is looking at the interaction between the home visitor and the caregiver, and between the home visitor and the child. And so there is a sense of equality of what the interaction is to allow us to measure interactions. So what do we know? Well, one finding that's come out of this so far, and we have a lot of other studies underway, but one finding, a consistent finding, is we look at the different dimensions of interaction. We look at the treatment effects. What we find, and we instrument. I mean, there's always a question that the home visitor may in fact be a home visitor who's a little more friendly, a little less friendly. So there may be some individual variation. And so what we can do is we can use the fact that the home visitors are going across villages. They're not always working in one village. And therefore we can get an independent measure of their ability and control for that and use that as an instrumental variable. But when we do that, what we find is that, and consistently, and we'll see in different dimensions of dynamic growth, that when we look at the interaction quality between the home giver and the home visitor and the caregiver, not the child, we find very strong effects on growth and cognitive performance. And that's true for all the other methods as well. So the question then goes, let's go beyond just looking at treatment effects. I mean, treatment effects are fine. The huge literatures, there are probably 100 conferences this summer telling you how to get it right, and the standard errors right, and all that. That's fine. You can go to those, and that's perfectly legitimate activity. What we want to do is look at the mechanisms producing those effects. And so let me give you a very simple model. This is a motivation. This is not what we actually estimate. So suppose we consider a single skill over a range of ages in the interval 0 to A bar, okay? So literally, teaching lesson starts the same for everybody at age A. So the same teaching lesson is used. That's key. And I'm going to define K as the level of knowledge. So you can think of it as human capital or knowledge, and there's an initial value. And so what we have is we have each week we have assessments of how the children are doing. And we can then assess whether or not, and there's an assessment scale, and that assessment scale was developed by those people I cited earlier. A person exhibits full mastery of skill if the level of the human capital passes a given threshold. So this is a threshold crossing model. And we can measure if a person at age A masters the skill. And we can measure mastery at each age of the child on each of the skills being tested, okay? And so what we do is we develop a model, and we follow a model that's, whoops, sorry, I skipped a little bit here. This is the deterministic version. It's a simple difference equation, how skills evolve, but we can include an ability parameter, this eta, and delta, which is the measure of the lessons. And what's crucial is that the lessons are common, the delta A, but of course the ability it isn't common, and we allow for that, and we measure that. We control for that, and we can get its variance as a matter of fact. And we're going to assume within intervals scale and variance. And so what we're going to do is look at self-productivity. Self-productivity is clearly just a derivative of Ka, and that's clearly going to be this function of delta A and eta. Dynamic complementarity is related by this cross-partial eta. And so ability here is a determinant of dynamic complementarity with the previous investment. And we add to this, because we don't think a deterministic model is appropriate, because we see a lot of fluctuation actually in the skills. What we see is we actually allow for idiosyncratic growth rates. And we use an old model by Rutherford. This is an old paper in Econometrica, 1955, as a matter of fact. And it's a model of random learning, and it's a random walk model. So we're going to use a version of that model. And we write down that the skill threshold crossing model, the index, if you will, that's crossing the threshold, is going to be a random walk component plus this accumulated lessons that come. This is at a single level. And so we get easily a dynamic complementarity and self-productivity. We can have, and it makes a difference, although I'm only going to talk about the multiplicative shock model for lack of time. We also can look at additive shocks, and it has a different specification, and it fits the data somewhat differently. And hopefully we can talk about that on Saturday. So if we write down this model, it's just a simple threshold crossing model, but it's based on an underlying dynamic. And the underlying dynamic then consists of these random walk components. It has cumulative lessons. Remember, all children are exposed to the same lesson. It's not a dynamic model that says, oh, you passed it, so we're going to now advance you more quickly. Everybody's getting the same thing. And it may be a dumb idea from the standpoint of pedagogy, but it's a great idea from the point of view of econometrics here. And so we can write down the model conditional on eta, and we just spare you the integral associated with eta. So there will be an ability and determinants of ability added to the model. So this is basically a threshold crossing model. And we can add to this, although we don't have results on this today, we can then also consider vector skills, where we think there's cross-fertilization. So more cognitive ability helps with language, and there's a lot of evidence for that. That language is very good in terms of acquisition of mathematical skill. Some of the work here by Golden Meadow and others. So we're doing that. We're going forward on that. But right now, we're not going to do 6, and it's something that we're very much engaged in doing. So the general model, though, just takes that simple model and embeds it in a somewhat more complex framework. I mean, just notationally complex. It's the same basic idea. We have a cap S set of skills taught. In our case, there are 4. There are different levels of skill taught at a given age, and the number of levels of difficulty of S for each skill. And so we can then write an index. And I realize this may be notation rich and maybe not very helpful, but anyway, here it is. That basically we can determine whether or not somebody has mastered the skill at A, and we have data on that week by week. And so we can write down this threshold crossing model, and the person can be consistent or can even fail in future weeks. The question is, what do we know about the ability? So what we can do then is, this is just unfortunate notation. I will verbally state what's going on. This is the age at which you start a given skill level at level L. And this is the age at which you finish. And the run is going to be the difference between these two, assuming consecutive runs. We do modify the model to allow for but I'm not going to get into that modification right now. And so literally the age of the start of the next one is just basically the length of the run, the age of the last start plus 1. So you're moving into a new age. And so what we can do is we can collect the indicators of knowledge in a teaching spell. So in any given spell, we have data on these individuals. I've dropped the I subscript over the period A star to A, and which is really basically over the interval where the skill is taught. And a test for learning is going to be a test for exchangeability. And we know that the test for exchangeability in learning is going to be robust to any invariant heterogeneity. So if ability is like a fixed effect, it's a random component, but it stays fixed over the interval, then we'd have exchangeability, but we wouldn't have any learning. And that would be a test then of whether or not this delta is 0 or not. And so a consequence of exchangeability is asking that sequences be backloaded, non-exchangeability. So with learning, sequences are backloaded in the sense that it's more likely later on, given repeated exposure to these lessons, that you're going to be answering questions correctly towards the end of the interval than towards the beginning. And so we can test exchangeability. Literally, here's an example, very simple example of exchangeable sequence. And what we would say is that if you have three trials and the one success, that the later success is the one more likely than the early success followed with a 0. So here's a typical growth pattern, and it's, you know, what you would expect. Now there's a problem, and we address this problem. I don't want to get into it because it's straightforward. Namely, that we expect there would be maturation and exposure effects. So that with any training, with any, what you're getting is anything, there would be normal growth of skill. And so we account for that. And we can do that by a common adjustment. We can test for exchangeability using, say, this logit framework, where tau A is the maturation exposure effect. And when we do so, we reject the exchangeability sequence in the vast majority of levels. So there is measure of learning going on, at least if you use this measure. But now what can we do with these data? We can come up with different measures of skill. And one measure is the proportion of correct answer. That's the traditional measure. That's the one that I think I was mentioning and most people use, I've used in the past. But if you look at what's going on, what you see is a pattern that shouldn't surprise you, but it's very, very interesting. What you see is that at each language difficulty level, there's going to be a pattern. And the pattern is going to be one where you initially learn something, the passing rate is low, and then it gradually increases. Then a new lesson, you know, these are difficulty levels. These are not tasks within the level. And what you see then, some levels are harder than others. Some have big falls, some are relatively straightforward and so forth. But that's a general pattern of growth. And the same thing is true for the growth in cognition. So you can see that there really is a sense there's learning going on in sense of correct passing rates. But there are a lot of other measures we can use. I don't have time to go over them, but if you think about it, since we have the individual dynamics, we know the time it takes to get the first correct answer. We know the time to full mastery, where once you get the answer, you stay with the right answer. And then you ask what fraction of children actually backslide. And so even though they got to the right answer first time, they weren't able to hold on to it. So these are different measures of knowledge, all of which we want to analyze and do analyze with this model. And out of it, we can also form an ability group. And the ability group is going to be a group that we're going to stratify. This is a somewhat empirical, well, it is an empirical partition, but it basically seems to describe the data pretty well. Namely, there's a group of kids, little children, who are basically passing the first task they're faced in each one of these levels more than 80% of the time. There's a group of people who are high ability. And here we can use a measure, a task-based measure of ability, and we can use and ask how well does the program change that ability level, and so on. Then there's a normal group that's somewhere between 80% and more than 50%, and then there's a slow group. So here's an example in cognitive ability. A fast group is about 27%, so a lot of sharp kids here. A normal group is about 60%, 57%, and the slow group is 15%. And you can see, and these traits seem to be stable, although they are affected by intervention. The interventions are not compensated fully. And we can then look at this dimension. Here's an example. We can measure the time to mastery for cognitive tasks by ability group. And so it's not surprising that the fast kids are basically getting, it's almost definitional here, they're mastering it very quickly. And you can see what fraction. The slow kids are just not getting success. It's taking them quite a while to get to full mastery. And so we can then look at whether or not once you've mastered the task, you stay with the task. And there's some relationship there with the kids getting there first, more likely to stay on it. And then we can look at a whole variety of measures of stability. What's interesting, though, is if you look at these different measures, and there are a lot of other measures we can derive, what we find is that time to mastery versus stability, the correlation is positive among these, well, time to mastery is a measure of, so the later the time, the slower the person. So negative correlation is expected. But what we're finding is generally strong correlations and an association of high ability measure, one high ability measure with another, and finding then the group is getting this structure. But you're finding that the correlation between time to mastery and stability is much weaker than it is, for example, between stability, passing rate, and stability rate, which is almost tautological, but time to mastery and passing rate there really is less than perfect correlation. So these are different measures. And so we can ask the question, and we just mentioned, coming back to the interaction, we're looking at what the home visitor and caregiver interaction is doing. Among all the different interactions that we consider, the one that is essentially the caregiver home visitor interaction is the one that promotes kids to being in the category of being fast in all skills. So you really are improving ability. And we want to think about this as like IQ. That is a measure that some people use of IQ. We can see a strong, effective intervention IQ. And you know, I found a number of other studies. Recent paper we had on Perry showed that Perry at 55 raised IQ. So this is now going, this is ridiculous literature that says it's fade out. And the literature on fade out is should be fading out rapidly because it's worn out and it doesn't look at the latest effect. But here we can actually see how we can measure ability. And there's stronger effects for boys than for girls. Generally speaking, boys are weaker, more susceptible, and therefore more beneficial from these interventions. So what we can do then is we look at the effects of interactions on the time to mastery of achieving skills. And here I'm just going to go through level by level by level. It's not uniform across levels, but it's definitely strong, especially at the lower levels, but rising as well. And we can look at stability.
Heckman, there is a question for you.
Question? Clarifying question? I don't see a chat on my screen. So what's the question?
So we have a couple of questions in the chat tool here that we're using for the summer school and the conference. And since you're moving more and more into the data part, maybe it would be good if you're fine with it. If you would like to tackle them all in the very end of your presentation, then just let me know now. Or...
Yeah, let me. I think maybe some can be explained, but I agree. I have a limited time and I want to get to the estimates of the model. I haven't, these are all kind of treatment effect type results, although interesting, I think. So we can look at a similar pattern as the interaction quality between the home visitor and the caregiver. And what we can see, again, this pattern that among all the interactions that we measure, the one that between the home visitor and the caregiver, which is what the intention was of these interventions. So it's not a shock that it has this effect. The question, though, is what can we test dynamic complementarity without making a strong cardinalization? And can children catch up? That's another way to talk about dynamic complementarity. Well, what happens is the kids are entering at random ages. That's partly due to administrative constraints. None of these kids have training, but of course they could grow up in different homes. They could imitate what their parents are doing. They could grow. Maturation effects are real. So what happens is that some children are learning simply because of exposure to the environment. And so what we really want to get at is a sense of how much of a compensation there is. So this is the monthly age at which children are enrolled into the program. And we can see this is fairly uniform over the ages 10 months to 25 months, but it's, and then it tapers off. And we can look then, and this is looks like a little messy here, but what we can do is look at the passing rates for language tasks by enrollment age. And what you can see is that the blue line enrolled early on in the program here, those kids are actually having a higher passing rate at a given age. And the ones who are entering late, they're generally behind at the ages where they're measured finally, they're in the program, but they're catching up slowly. And at the end, there's not a lot of difference. And literally that's going to come back. We're going to talk about that as a key feature of the model. But that's true for cognitive tasks, for language tasks, and it's also true for fine motor tasks. So there is some catching up, but it's not full, and it's far from full. And the same thing is true for other measures of length of enrollment. Gross motor skills is a non-starter, just doesn't affect it. So let me, what we found is that early advantage is declining with age. And that's consistent, as we're going to show, with depreciation and the evolution of new skills and abilities. So here's the model, equation 8. I already laid it out. And we're going to parameterize this model so that there will be individual aspects. Lessons are common, but the abilities are not. And the environment in which they're administered is not. And therefore, what we can do in this model, and we have a proof of non-parametric identification. Although the model that we're going to fit today is parametric. And we can, under conditions that are basically known, I'm not going to list a whole group of them, and their subsequent conditions on normalizations of the underlying threshold crossing model, that what we can do is we can look at this sequence of threshold crossing models, and we can non-parametrically identify this under known conditions. And this is the crucial thing, we can identify the latent index function that underlies that up to its unknown skill. So the initial condition is a final, and the crucial notion then is that as we move across levels within a given skill, the final output at one level is the initial condition for the next. And so we link these models under skill invariance, under the age invariance assumption. So this is the previous model we talked about. We will parameterize initial conditions. We know something about family background and the like. And so what we're going to test is this question of common scale invariance within each level of skill. And what we're going to do then is say, what does this mean? Well, what we're really saying is that you start the next level with a skill that you had last level. That's a measure of skill invariance. Strong condition. And there's no reason. And in fact, if you look at some of the theory of scaling, I mean, some of the work by Kranz and Tversky and Moose, you'll see that this is a strong condition, something like this condition, in terms of coming up with an affine scale. But it has to be affine in the way it's being used in econometric models using complementarity. But we don't have to assume anything across levels about the shocks or even the ability parameter. It could be level specific, although we're not really accounting for that today. And it could be that the lessons are different across L. So that's not required. We can weaken this a lot. In other words, we don't have to, we can make very general models. We're not going to talk about that. But we are going to look at this question of skill invariance. And the key property is this notion here that the capital that you acquire is some lambda, some function lambda of the capital inherent from the previous level. Now that's going to be an affine transformation under our interpretation of what skill invariance is. And I think a sense that it's an additive function in terms of investments over periods. So we can identify this model. How much time do I have, Philip?
So you fulfilled your commitment, but of course we're happy to stay around a little longer. So.
Oh wait, I thought I had 5 more minutes because you started late. But
okay, so those you definitely have. So the question.
Okay, fine. Okay, well let me just say that we can go through a proof that's a fairly standard proof if you've gone through index function models. This is a heuristic we come up with. Our formal proof is far more general than this, but we can allow then for random coefficient. That's allowing for ability variation, and we can also allow for identification of the variance. So we're allowing then the variance term in the random walk probability model to have this omega component associated with ability differences and the like. And therefore we can identify these functions up to scale, and we need one normalization. This normalization at one level will allow us to make statements about these functions across levels. And so this is just another proof of, I won't be able to go through it, but we can test skill invariance, and the basic notion is what I said, that basically we get this index, we normalize it, and we keep it asking, is it invariant across levels? We can use that as a basis for a test, a Rao test under the null. So let me, so we can formally identify, maybe hopefully on Saturday we can get to it. The estimation method is going to include the simulated method of moments, and we're doing it at each skill level, and we have a variety of different moments which correspond to these different ability parameters. And so therefore what we're doing, and we also have to account, we do standard errors by bootstrapping, and I forgot to mention that the randomized studies were done at the village level, so clustering has to be accounted for. But anyway, let me just go through one example, Philip, and I'll stop, okay? And that is for the learning component, this component here, which is the only thing we can only get it in combination. There's some product of delta and E of eta. What we find is the interaction measures significantly improve the child learning ability for each task. And we find that the grandmother has a significant negative effect on learning. So another grandmother And in this environment, it's the grandmothers are typically educated at a far lower level than the mothers. We find, of course, that fast learning children have a higher learning component, the higher ability children. There exists a large variation of learning, performance by ability. We find a lot of variation. And so, for example, if you look at the learning component across the difficulty levels, they vary enormously. And in fact, they vary, of course, by ability. The higher ability children are learning at a more rapid level, have higher ability components. But level 5 turns out to be a very difficult level. If you go back and read the question, you'll realize they're learning really something new in language they didn't have before. And therefore, there really is a sense in which there's heterogeneity in learning, and we can then measure how the children are affected. The variance is affected. And so when you look at the variance of shocks, where are they the greatest? Where the passing rates vary the most. And so let me see if I can get you an example here. Here's an example of a passing rate by task order. This is not imposed, so generally speaking, the scale that we were given has a passing rate as expected, but not uniformly. And the skill requirements are rising. That's not imposed either, so it does suggest that at different difficulty levels, the skill requirement is increasing. We find that children, so let me give you an example here. This is the average passing rate of language tasks by level. And so what we find is that the structure is what I was saying. You start with the first task, and then you can see the passing rate fluctuates. And in those areas where there's a big jump here in the passing rates, there, the estimated variances turn out to be very high. That's associated with high shocks. Now, you could say, what is the high shock measuring? Well, it could be just the shock to the individual, but it could also be the shock that comes from the examination itself, in the sense that the questions do not seem, at least from this econometric procedure, to be of uniform difficulty, even within the interval. And that's the book component here, which is worth taking at and examining the test going forward. And so we can test the scale invariance assumption. Here, I'll stop. Scale invariance is this condition I've already talked about. It's a test for particular affine transformation. And literally, we're looking at a affine transformation of the initial condition from the previous level, as a function of the next level as a function of the previous level. And so the beta naught and beta 1L are components. Under skill invariance, beta naught would be 0 and beta 1L would be 1. And so what we can do is we can estimate that model. And this is the kind of estimate that we get. What we find is that, again, this is all just for language. We have a whole series of tests for other skills. And what you can see then is the difficulty level. By difficulty level, you're finding pretty strong evidence for skill invariance, but over this interval, 2 to 5, and then starting 8 to 11. But there is some departure from that in terms of the mean, in terms of the intercept. If you look, for example, at scale invariance in terms of the slopes, what you find is some imprecision in estimating it, but a sharp difference at level 8, where I showed you already. There was some issue associated with the passing rates. And so this gives us a sense of, so I'm going to skip all this. We have lots of other stuff, but what it is just doing the skill by skill, and I'm not going to be able to do it. I'll just conclude with a statement we can also look at that goes to an old problem stated by Berman, Pollock, and Taubman years ago in their book, actually even earlier, and that is are parents compensating or reinforcing? And so what we do is we ask a very simple question. We ask the question, we look at caregiver playing tests with the child. So now we're asking if the caregiver, not the home visitor, how often is the caregiver playing language tasks with the child by ability level? And what we can see is that the slower the child's ability, the more the tasks are playing with the child. Maybe it's an easier, better source of pleasure, maybe not, I don't know, but that's a consistent finding across different measures. So what we do is then examine these mechanisms. The program is of great interest because it's low cost. It's a new model of skill formation. We can analyze a unique data structure. and we can find measures that are free. We can test certain aspects which have always troubled me, and they trouble the literature. I mentioned Pavan, I mentioned Augustinelli and Wiswall, I trust, and then Freiberger as a reanalysis of some of Orazio's work, and which is not very complimentary, showing the scale invariance problem. And so what we do is we test for whether or not scale invariance is useful, and then we have a way of getting around it and looking at certain measures of complementarity and so forth. And what we find then is scale invariance is older over certain intervals. And those intervals could more or less be found by looking closely at the questionnaires. So even though I haven't done it today, we did do that. I can show you, you sort of believe that these are the same scale. And we do find evidence, though. So remember the fact that kids were catching up at the end. Well, that could also be consistent with depreciation. And it could also be consistent with the emergence of new skills, which we haven't really tested. And I think there is some sense in which, if you look at the skills that we measure, there really are these multiple skills. Adolescent psychologists discuss this a lot, but a lot of work in psychology talks about these multiple skills. And so the frontier for us going forward within this framework is doing this equation 12, which we'll be happy to report on, hopefully Saturday. No, sorry. Okay, well, thank you very much. Sorry I overstayed my welcome. It's only 5 minutes, so 5 minutes, sorry. So, okay, Philip, I'm sorry to prevail upon you.
All right, so maybe I'll just start with a couple of big picture questions. So one of them was that, which was raised by also John in the chat room, is that now that you start to accumulate similar, or try to learn something about the technology of skill formation from similar programs that were implemented in very different settings, so Jamaica and China. How do you think about the external validity of your findings? Because one of the graphs in the very beginning looked very promising in the sense where you compared the one of the implications, if I recall correctly, of the technology between the two countries. And then along the same vein, whether you could maybe say a couple of words about how research in neuroeconomics informs the specification of your technology, but also the kind of research question that you focus on.
Okay, two excellent questions. Let me answer the first question. We are actively engaged, and I think I saw Orazio's face on one of the screens. I'm happy to see him. Orazio and I and a group of people who've been using versions of the Jamaican have formed a consortium, and where the idea is to synthesize and look at these studies within a common framework. Now, the kind of data that I have, to my knowledge, is not available for some of the other versions, but there does seem to be some concordance in the findings. We're going back, a group here at Chicago and in other places, looking at, around the country and in China, looking at the data on Jamaica. We have the data on the Jamaica. So we can then track how these programs in China is linking with the way that children are developed in Jamaica. And there does seem to be some notion of external validity. I think this external validity, remember what we're getting at is something that's very intrinsically human here. We're talking about parenting and how you interact with children. I can't imagine, maybe in Spartan families in 500 BC or some 300 BC, 400, I guess, what you'd find is that the structure of the household would be such the kids were taken away, there were no parents, and so. But in general families where parents are interacting, I think there is a certain commonality. And here, just a question of how the parents are interacting with the child. We're not measuring the interaction of the child-parent. What we're measuring, we did at the very end, but the main measures were ones of how this interaction seemed to cause growth of the skill. And it was the interaction between the caregiver and the home visitor. So there's a certain kind of bridge that we're building there conceptually. But in principle, we're going to put these data sets together and then line them up side by side to see what the commonalities are and what they aren't. Some vary, some are more center-based rather than just home visiting. So there will be some differences. But we have a group that we're working with also in Brazil and some other groups now working with us in Canada looking at the same kind of intervention, where we can look at the growth of skills at a very micro level. So I'm confident that we'll be able to answer your question. But so far, if you look at the growth of skills, China and Jamaica, I was staggered that in fact those skill growth curves lined up. That was not rigged. We didn't force that. We were using a very tough measure of what skill dynamics is, and we actually found that it fit. So that's interesting. So wait, there was another question or not?
The second part of the question was more the underlying forces that allow you to draw these comparisons.
Oh, yes, right. Well, if you look at the model, this is something that I've been really intrigued with. You know, if you go into psychology, you can see there's a lot of interest now in what are called Polya models. When I was talking, this is an old interest of mine years ago, looking at heterogeneity versus state dependence. You know, Polya years ago had this EARN scheme, and which he imagined learning or some kind of task activity being putting a bunch of balls in an urn. So if you get a correct answer, what you do is you get some balls in the urn, and if you get the correct answer, you get reinforcement. So the whole theory of reinforcement learning can be captured by Polya urn schemes, and it has been. Now, recently, there's some work along those lines, interpreting experiments in game theory from what looks like a totally different world, from Roth and Ever, I believe is his name, another, I think he's an Israeli game theorist. I don't know him so well, but the paper is using exactly this notion of reinforcement learning. And now, whether reinforcement learning is right on the top of the deck, but it does seem, I mean, even if you look back at some of the original work, the work by in neuroscience, for example, by what's the name of the guy at Columbia? The guy who had the simple one-cell mollusk. There was this notion of reinforcement, and that literally exposure and re-exposure literally affected, and you could see it physiologically, the learning, the brain, such as it was, of this single, I don't know, the single cell, but very simple organism that this guy studied. So there really is some neurological basis for saying, if you hammer this thing home, and people will say, teachers will say, you keep hammering it home, they'll eventually remember it. But there really is a sense we can see kids learning. Some kids learn right away, and they're very smart, and they stay throughout. So we have a measure of IQ that's kind of interesting, and we can see whether we can budget. But on top of it, there really is a sense that we see reinforcement. And some of those kids, we didn't develop it today in the short time we have, but some of those kids drop in their ability, and they don't succeed. They're not stable. They learn the lesson, they get a correct answer, and then they fall back again. They go below the threshold, and then they're continuously reinforced. So we can see that they're generally, most of the kids are able to pass the test at the end. But we'll note that even if the kids can't pass at a given level, they're still advanced to the next level. That's the ruthlessness. Maybe this is something that's not a desirable trait for other reasons, for econometric purposes and for studying neural processes. It's quite interesting. So there really is, I think, a neural basis, and it's an old model. Bush and Mosteller have this theory of reinforcement learning, and looking at these runs patterns, the whole literature on heterogeneity and state dependence. And Pecos has a new paper using some of those same techniques in IO. So there really is a sense that learning has this dynamic quality, and that something like a Polya urn scheme may have a neuroscience counterpart. But I'm not a neuroscientist, so I can't really tell you. I wish to God, I mean, it's certainly the case, though, that there is a sense of try again. And what I've seen from the neuroscientific evidence shows that there really is a neurological or a biological response to repeated exposure to these ideas. And so you'll see like white matter and gray matter forming in response to repeated stimuli. And that's really what's going on here.
All right, thank you very much. So maybe before we continue with questions from the audience here, is from our online participants, is there anyone who would like to ask some questions directly? All right, that does not appear to be the case. Then we'll just move on with our questions from here. So there's one by Monica who was wondering whether there's a distinction in your model between learning ability and the skill itself, and in what sense they're independent or not. And the second one was, since it was such a focus of a lot of your earlier work, what's the role of measurement error in the new framework that you're proposing here?
Well, first of all, there is a sharp, in the model, is a very sharp distinction between learning and ability. If I can find it. Well, here, take this last slide. I don't know if it's still displayed. This ADA parameter is basically going to be a measure of what we call ability. It's the rate of acquisition of knowledge. The learning itself, though, is here, and it's the growth and decay. But we separate it out because it's mediated through effects of inheritance of previous knowledge and then increment. So knowledge really is this thing that allows you to pass the barrier, the first level, the second level, and so forth. And then learning is something that enhances knowledge. So in the sense that change in knowledge is clearly closely related to the change into these ability and lesson parameters. So the quality of the lesson, this delta L, plays a big role, and the quality of the ability of the child plays a role. But the ability is somewhat separate from this K, and we can isolate that K, and that K is something that can be under age invariance goes through. Even if it's not age invariant, there still can be an inheritance, and we can call that depreciation or emergence of new ability, which essentially swamp the previous abilities, or at least augment the previous one, give a richer dimension. So I think there is a distinction that can be made.
All right, then maybe the last question was on the role of measurement error in
measurement error. Well, we can actually think of these shocks as a kind of measurement error if you want. I mean, depends on how you want to call epsilon. I mean, epsilon here on equation 12 could be something like, remember what we know, what we're doing is we're asking, can this guy pass the threshold? I mean, this is an old idea here, that the threshold, that this measurement, the one thing that we can measure, however, is that if agents are not involved in learning, okay, then we could still come up with a measure, at least relative measure of the disturbance epsilon. And so we can then make a distinction between the measurement error per se, or the shocks that occur without learning. And then we can impose the data from that group on top of the group that is actually learning, that's actually in the intervention. So by that procedure, by having two different groups, you could make that distinction. But conceptually, there is if we only have this one group, then we don't know what is this epsilon. Is epsilon simply some random acquisition of knowledge? It could simply be that I'm just mismeasuring the K for that particular age in this model. And that's a legitimate possibility. And it could also be, as I was showing in those passing rates, some of these exams look like the tasks rates are not uniform. They're not, kids are starting, even the bright kids are starting, and then they're dropping off and they're starting again. So what that means is that the scale is possibly off. And you could call that a form of measurement error. And that's going to be picked up here in the model by shocks, what we're calling shocks. And there are definite shocks. And in fact, I didn't have time to go through it. But when we look at the questions at each level, we look at the detailed questions, we find that when these questions start to vary a lot in their complexity, even within a level, that our estimated values of signal, the variance here in epsilon, gets very big. So that's a question. That's a partial response.
All right, thank you very much. Is there any further questions in the room? All right, John, let me get you the microphone. 1 second.
Let me make a statement that I'm really sorry I can't be there. I mean, maybe I'm just overly cautious, but I really was fearful, given my early exposure, my early shot, and the fears of efficacy and the issues about. So I apologize. I really would like to have been
Jim, one issue too is about a role of emotion or motivation, right? Like if you're asked to learn something you consider dumb, you may not want to work hard to learn it, but if it's something you think is really cool, you'll work really hard, right? And you know, how much, you know, like when the kids are given this thing, is it some like fuddy-duddy coming in and they just say, why do I have to do these stupid things, right? Whereas it's something your peers were doing, which was really cool, like learning, you know, play a to do a hula hoop or something that was considered fun, maybe they would learn it a lot faster. So, you know, is there a way to get motivation in the what you want to learn, right?
Yes, actually, it's a very good question. I mean, it's partially captured by this model. This is a very mechanical model. I recognize that. It's looking mostly at the technology. It's not like we do have a model, which we haven't yet to fit, which is, well, we wrote out the formal analysis of it, which was exactly about motivating the child and what the child incentives were and how the child and parent and the caregiver would come along and motivate the child. And there is other work on this as well. So that's a legitimate question, but we can still allow that remember, we're allowing there to be some variation in ability. And this ability doesn't have to just be cognitive ability. You think of it that way, but it could also be, you know, how easily interested they are in the task. The one thing about it's not, I understand the old fuddy-duddy business. These are all young kids coming in, and the lesson is from the parent. It's not the lesson that the caregiver gives or the home visitor gives is to the caregiver. It's the caregiver-child interaction that we're measuring the effect of, but we're only measuring whether or not the caregiver, well, the home visitor also interacts with the child, but those interactions seem to have very little effect on the rate of growth of skills, which I think is interesting. So we should build that in, and we haven't yet. And it's going to be a little formidable, though, given our data, but we can say, look, the parent, remember, we do allow for the caregivers to be different. And so we allow for heterogeneity in ability. And we race through that when we were talking about the IV, but we could see how effective this caregiver was, not only with this child in this village, but how effective they were in others. So we think that may be a motivational factor, and we can control for that, and we do control for that. And so in that sense, we can partially look at what you're saying. But I completely agree that it would be the incentive to do this. The incentive to do this, though, is not the same. I mean, it's not like the parents are with this kid, you know, 24 hours a day, I guess, or the caregiver. And it's a different situation. It's just what the parents are doing, what the caregivers are doing with those kids. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to add something like, so in the model, yeah, we do not very specific to try to identify the motivation part. But if you look at like the term delta and eta, so eta in our model is very individual specifically, but the delta is based on the, you know, the difficulty level is the same across all the children. So in some sense, like if like the, you know, the task is very boring, so the delta term can capture like some component in that sense. For example, if like all the children feel like the task is relatively boring, and we may expect that the delta term will be a small values, because children get boring, and then like it will not improve, have a in terms of the learning component, and it will be lower. And also we have like separate term in terms of the task difficulty level. So the delta term can be separate out from the task difficulty level. That can be treated as some kind of reduced form to capture some information in terms of boring. That is just what I added. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, in our analysis, we see, if we look at that graph, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find it so quickly here. We have so many of them, and that's because it's all we did is just replicated this across different skills. So it's really the same analysis, just repeated across different skills. But if you look at this one graph, here it is, you can see that there really are tremendous different. One skill, 5, is a very hard task. Maybe it's boring, but whatever it is, the learning component there is very, very small. If you look at task 7, not task, but level 7 within the language skill, you can see that learning is very rapid, and it may be that it's trivial. It may be very interesting. So that's one interpretation of child engagement. But the child engagement is an indirect estimate through what the parent is doing as a result of what the home visitor instructed the parent to do or motivated the parent to do. Some of it is also the home visitor. Some of it is also heterogeneity among the parents in terms of their receptiveness to the program.
All right, thank you very much. Orazio, just go right ahead.
Yes, I would to add something after John's question and the reply that Jim and Jim offered. First of all, thanks, Jim. There was a great presentation. There is lots of new stuff. It's exciting to see all this stuff.
No, I'd like to exchange this. And of course, you know, we have this group that we're working on now.
Yes, yes.
Which answers John's question, I hope. And you know,
But the one thing that
we're going to send notices out and everything. So
yeah.
yes, in fact, anybody else who wants to join the group, here's your invitation. But go ahead. Sorry.
The one thing that about Reach Up that I know reasonably well, that is very specific to that type of curriculum, and the Reach Up people insist a lot on is that the curriculum, the lessons, every weekly lesson that is they're mapped to a specific age, should be adjusted to the level of the child ability. That answers directly John's question. You know, lots of the training of the visitors of Reach Up, at least in the versions I saw in Colombia and India, lots of the training goes to instill in the visitor the ability to identify a child that is already doing quite well. And so you might want to move it to a little bit harder material, even if it's young for that. On the contrary, if it's a child that is struggling, you don't want to frustrate them with material that is too hard and maybe slide back to something a little bit easier. So I think, you know, I need to observe the way you parameterize this model. But one dimension that would be nice to add to that is the delta term in the last equation that was on the slides. Maybe should be made a little bit more heterogeneous, because that's what at least the version of the Reach Up that I've seen implemented is. It would be really nice to add that thing. The other two things I want to add is that one, I think it's great that you're trying to measure the interactions between the visitor and the caregiver, because that's where I'm convinced that that's where the action is. It's not on the exposure that the child gets once a week with this person coming to the home. I think that's a great point of that you made. And then, you know, I agree with what Jim said, that there are lots of commonality and new things that we're learning from this type of things in terms of the mechanism and how they work. There, you know, we have seen lots of common impacts in Jamaica, in China, in Colombia, and India. For instance, the results are reinforcing. You know, we've seen that in other places as well, and I think that's a nice set of results. Having said that, I think there's still lots of things that we don't know, and so it's an exciting research agenda.
Well, thank you, but I hope we can continue to collaborate together. This is just the opening shot here. Let me answer one aspect of your question, though, and that is, I think it's really, I glossed over this, but in the form of the model that we have right now, there are a lot of identification issues here, which you know sound pretty slippery, and I said it was non-parametric. This is not a non-parametric estimate. We were making assumptions all over the place about error terms being normal, but I figured, well, John could care less. In principle, we don't have to do that, but more importantly, though, if you look at this slide, I don't know if anybody can see it still, but if you look what's the case is that with this particular model, the way we model the growth rate, the lesson itself and the ability of the child get intermingled. And they're multiple. Now you could have additive components that don't interact. So I completely accept what you're saying. But if you really stay strictly with the interactive component, there's no way to distinguish those two. And the reason why I say that is what we're really doing is we estimate the heterogeneity. I didn't go over that, but there's a lot of heterogeneity in ability. But that ability is really capturing delta and eta. And it's exactly the story that you told. I mean, the statement you told about adapting the curriculum has always been haunting me as a serious issue here. But we've always been told, and Zhou, you can tell me if I'm wrong in saying it, that literally they claim they implement the same lessons. Now, I don't believe that's humanly possible, but I think visitors will probably...
Probably that is different between China Reach and the other Reach Hub implementation. At least in our data, like in terms of 97% of, we have each task report for, weekly information, and we know the children's weekly age, and we know what task they teach. And over 97% of task is exactly as the weekly age design. So that means like the home visitor in China Reach, at least the data we have is exactly implemented by, the curriculum design, like, yeah.
Yeah, but even if that's true, it's probably also true that the quality of the visitor, the ability that the visitor has to implement the curriculum, even if they use exactly the same,
that part I totally agree. Like,
and I think the solution to that, a possible solution to that, would be to try to add measurement to, if you could get some observations of specific visits and abilities that the visitors have, and then you could try to put some observables in that delta and to try to identify that one.
Well, actually, we have that. So in the supervisor report, they have like 3 aspects. 2 aspects is the interactions, and another aspect is about teachability. So in the slides, we didn't show that, but we do include that component because they have like almost 10 questions, which is exactly target the home visitors' teachability to see whether they prepare the documents well or like, the lesson well, like the supervisor have that. We include that component in the delta eta component. Yeah,
that's
there.
great.
Yeah, it's there. Yeah, and we also we also have some table to show like what's the impact of the delta eta in terms of like to see how that one correlated with the task performance, like from our structural model, and also like so we also have those like but the presentation is short, like we don't have time to show all those results. Yeah.
All right, then thank you very much. Any last questions? All right, then let's thank Jin and Professor Heckman again for their presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm glad to interact, and I dearly wish I were there to talk to people for many reasons. It's a group I deeply respect, and it's also some of the papers look extremely interesting. I haven't been able to follow all of them yet, but I gather they're going to be recorded, right, so that I can play them. Which is what I plan to do, right? Which I will do
after the presentation.
Yeah.
And thank you very much. And then we look forward to fleshing out these ideas a little further on Saturday. Thank you.
If there's interest, if there's no interest, we can talk about causality. Totally different subject.
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you for inviting us.